Good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Josh Wilson, and I will be serving as the timekeeper in tonight's debate. I have a few housekeeping items to share with you, after which I will introduce our speakers. Tonight's debate will follow a classic format composed of several rounds of speeches and cross-examinations with time for audience question and answer at the end. In the interest of maximizing the speakers' opportunity to engage with one another, we ask that after welcoming the speakers, all audience members remain respectfully silent until the end of the debate. When the time for Q&A arrives, please keep your questions succinct so we can get through as many questions as possible. And now I have the honor of introducing our speakers. John Miller graduated from Gettysburg College, a Lutheran-affiliated liberal arts college with a double major in philosophy and Greek. After getting his MA from the University of Maryland, he then taught Latin in a private school in New York City for 2 years, while working on his PhD at New York University. Being twice Scott's age, he has been privileged to teach in universities and colleges for more than half a century, and twice on a shipboard campus that took students for a semester voyage, in 1969 to Europe, North Africa, and South America, and in 1990 to a number of countries in Asia. Please welcome Dr. John Miller. Scott Mahurin graduated from the University of Idaho with degrees in history and philosophy in 1999. He was a teacher for 18 years in private Christian schools, primarily teaching Latin, history, and rhetoric. He is now the director of Florida Preborn Rescue, a pro-life nonprofit organization based here in St. Petersburg. Apart from his work as an activist, he has authored the book, Your Son is a Wuss, which critiques modern child-centered parenting in the church. Please welcome Scott Mahurin. Thank you all. As you know, the resolution before us tonight is the question, is abortion morally acceptable? We'll begin with the affirmative opening from Dr. Miller.
Well, thank you, Josh, very much. Thank you, Scott, for the invitation by Florida Preborn Rescue. And I appreciate your being here this evening. It's a privilege to be here to talk to you about a very, very important moral problem. I'm a philosopher, and philosophers look at a problem, they try to understand what the issue is, they look at the alternatives, and they try to assess the reasons and the evidence for choosing one alternative over another. I would have preferred if it would have been a dialogue instead of a debate, but it's a debate, so that's what it is. I'm going to try to offer reasons why it is moral for a woman to be allowed to have an abortion. I'm going to offer evidence to support that. As a philosopher, I know that good, highly intelligent, brilliant people, philosophers throughout the ages, and people like you and me disagree. We disagree. So tonight it's not a question of whether one person or one side is good and the other is bad, or one side is true and the other is false, or one side is right and the other is wrong. It's a question of trying to understand one another and see the reasons why people who are intelligent may not agree, why they hold different perspectives. Before I met Scott, I saw his video, so that when I met him over here at USF St. Petersburg campus, I immediately recognized him. We sat down that afternoon and had lunch, and subsequently we've had lunch over in Tampa. Scott is a good person, an honest person, a person of integrity, and a person of commitment. And I like Scott, and we consider ourselves friends. We share the fact that we were both philosophy majors. We share the fact that we both taught Latin. And he told me that he thought about going into the ministry when he was in college. I did too when I was a freshman. Neither of us did, but at least that's what we thought about. Now, I'm here tonight not to try to change your mind, but to offer reasons and evidence why it is moral for a woman to have an abortion. It would be a much better world if people were responsible sexually, if there were no unwanted children. But sometimes birth control fails, sometimes birth control is very difficult for the poor to get, sometimes it just happens. And the question is, does that make sense to force a woman to carry an unwanted fetus to term? I want to suggest this is not pro-life, anti-life. Not pro-abortion, anti-abortion. That's absurd. That's absurd. So I'm going to argue the morality of abortion, irrespective of my own views. As a philosopher, I'm trained to do that. Scott told me 2 years ago, when we were going to have this debate, and later he affirmed, that he was going to draw on the authority of the Scriptures. He was going to argue of the right of the fetus to life, and he was going to argue that the human being begins at conception. I deny all three. I deny the authority of the Bible as the inerrant Word of God, even inspired. Read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, as I did just a few days ago in preparation for this. Chapter 1 lays out the creation in a totally different way than chapter 2. Scholars will say that the reason for these 2 entirely different accounts is that there are 2 different sources. The first chapter of Genesis is E, using Elohim as the word for God. The second chapter uses Yahweh or Jehovah as the word for God. Different sources, different times, different perspectives. In my classes, I share, when we talk about religion, sometimes we talk about the nature of God, sometimes we talk about the Bible. I give my students a handout by Karen Armstrong, brilliant scholar, who wrote a book called The History of God. But I quote from a book called The Case for God, in which she says, the idea that the Scripture should be read literally is a new idea. It's not how the old theologians took Scriptures at all. If you lay the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side. I have a book called Gospel Parallels. I didn't bring it. I thought about bringing it, but I didn't want to lose it. If you lay them side by side, you see where Matthew, Mark, and Luke differ. Maybe they contradict themselves. Does that sound like the Word of God? Does that sound like the inerrant Word of God? Well, I'm not here to talk about the Bible. I'm here to talk about abortion. So the second point is the view of preborn rescue, the view of pro-life, that abortion is murder. I have lunch every Friday with 2 professors, Professor Lawrence of zoology, Professor Dawes of botany. I asked them 2 weeks ago, when does life begin? When does the human being begin? Of course, they had no better idea than you or I. The point is that a fertilized egg is not a human being. It's a fertilized egg. An embryo is not a human being. It's an embryo. A fetus is not a human being. It's a fetus. So to think that to kill a fertilized egg or a fetus or an embryo is murder is just mistaken. The body develops. I have students who are nurses. My sister-in-law is a nurse. My first cousin is a nurse. But both of my first cousins are nurses. The body begins. The body, after the conception, it takes about 4 weeks for a spinal column, a rudimentary spinal column, a rudimentary heart, rudimentary brain to begin. It takes a while. The lungs are the last organ to develop. And that doesn't develop until about 26 weeks, which is why if a baby is born premature, survival rate is very low because the lungs aren't developed. The brain develops. We have three brains. We have a reptilial brain. We have a mammalian brain. We have a prefrontal cortex, which makes the human beings different from the other animals. Three brains. They're not present in a fertilized egg or an embryo or a fetus until very, very late.
It's time for the opening.
Got it? Yep. Whoa. Okay. Now, sorry. All right.
We'll now have the negative opening from Mr. Mahurin.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'd like to thank USFC and Pete. I'd like to thank the police that are present. Andy Dang of Student Services was our liaison, and he did a great job. And I'd like to thank Dr. Miller for coming tonight. Before I begin my formal remarks, I'd like to express my deep respect and admiration for John and his outstanding career in teaching philosophy. I've enjoyed getting to know him these last several months and consider him a friend. He's not actually twice my age, but he's pretty close. So, we have a lot in common. We both taught Latin. We both, I think, had similar teaching styles. I have some students here that apparently survived my classes and are still alive. We both resisted technology in the classroom. Hence, you're going to just have to listen to people talk. And we share similar concerns about our current environment culturally, politically, and all that. So one of our goals tonight is to show that we can disagree about a topic and yet be friendly about it. He is my friend now, and when the debate is over, he will still be my friend. If this debate were about credentials and experience, there wouldn't really be much contest. He's taught longer than I've been alive. But if this, debate were about physical mass, then I would. So we'll just have to pick some other standard to go by. By agreeing to this debate on the morality of abortion, Dr. Miller has done something that I don't think he intended to do. By agreeing to come debate, he has conceded the debate. He has conceded the debate because he has conceded that morality exists, and in doing so, he said that at least some abortions are morally acceptable. Tonight, I will demonstrate that there can be no morality of any kind that excuses the act of abortion. If you look around this room, you will see different people with different ideas, backgrounds, races, genders, all kinds of people. We're different human beings. But we are human beings, and because we were human beings, we were born at one point. Because we were born, you have a birthday. And because you have a birthday, you also have a conception day, the day you were conceived. The moment that your father's sperm and mother's egg united inside your mother's womb, you became a separate and unique individual from your parents. From that moment, I will argue that your life has deserved protection. You had the right, but from that moment, not to be killed. Yes, you were small and even in some respects microscopic, but you were still a human being. Your DNA structure, heartbeat, skeletal outline, all of those things were latent there in the DNA and were separate from your parents. Now, some of you are college students or younger students, and you might be at the age where you're wondering if you're really related to your parents. You might be wondering, there's no way, maybe at Thanksgiving you're bracing yourself, you're going, I'm going to go home, I have nothing in common with these people. Maybe they made a mistake at the hospital. I felt that way a few times in my life. Maybe my parents felt like, there's no way you could be our son. But in a way, you're right, because you are a separate individual from your parents, and you've been that way since you were conceived. Your life was in need of legal protection, just as it is now. I have three main points I'd like to mention tonight. I'm going to argue that abortion is immoral and should be illegal because it is the intentional destruction of a human life. This is undisputed. Number two, abortion is immoral and should be illegal because it gives those in power the determination to tell whose lives are worth more than other lives. This is not a good idea historically. Abortion is immoral and should be illegal because it introduces a sliding scale of personhood. If we cannot protect all life from the moment of conception, then we must determine from ourselves when life or protectable life begins. Now, John mentioned he doesn't accept the authority of Scripture. Great. So then it's all about competing values. Who says when life begins? And we may argue we don't know. I will argue if we don't know, we should protect all life. Abortion is, so historically, humans have been really bad at protecting other human beings. I don't know if you guys are history buffs, but we've been really bad at, we were really good at dehumanizing other people. We're really good at racism, we're really good at sexism, we're really good at genocide, we're really good at all those. Maybe we should have another standard besides what humans come up with to decide our morality. Our society, in many ways, is already embracing life in the womb. Think about the gender reveal parties that you see on social media. Society recognizes that when a woman is pregnant, she's pregnant with a human baby. Gender reveals are not species reveals. Okay? What are you having? A boy or a girl? A walnut? A kangaroo? We don't know. We don't know the species. No, you do know the species. It's a human being. Okay. Our laws recognize this. If a pregnant woman and her baby are murdered, the accused will face 2 counts of first-degree murder in the state of Florida. Our laws here recognize the humanity of the preborn at any stage of development, yet abortion is still legal. Science recognizes this. As I mentioned earlier, at the moment of conception, all the DNA you will ever have is present. All that you needed was nourishment and room to grow. And it worked for all of you. So welcome again to planet Earth. So, you might be wondering why a pro-life Christian missionary like me is arguing in this way. Well, the reason is simple. We have an orderly universe that God created with a purpose. Christians often get accused of being anti-science. We're actually not anti-science. There would be no science without God. The world would not create in an orderly way without a creator or a maker. But I doubt John will argue much about the science, because if he did, he knows he would not be persuasive. He must frame the issue in terms of rights. Either all humans have rights because they are human, or some humans have some rights determined to be so by other humans, normally the powerful. There are only 2 possibilities. We must affirm all human beings have rights. There is no moral system on the planet that would justify the killing of an innocent preborn child. Morality involves how humans treat each other. It can be done descriptively to refer to certain codes of conduct put forward by a society or group. It can be used normatively to refer to a code of conduct that, given specified conditions, would be put forth by rational persons. Now, I do not believe John to be irrational. I do not believe if you currently are pro-choice that you are irrational. I do think that we should examine our thoughts on this issue. If we do not protect the preborn's rights, if we do not say they are human, then we must by necessity choose a different time, a different method, a different way to measure when we can protect human beings. This always ends up in the most vulnerable among us to be dehumanized and destroyed. I'm happy to share the stage with John. Thank you all for coming. I look forward to the rest of the night.
Interrupted by Dr. Miller.
Because I want to quote some of what Scott said, I'm going to refer to this paper here and read part of it. I've agreed tonight to defend the morality of abortion. Speaking for pro-life, Scott said, no morality of any kind can excuse the act of any abortion. Well, 50, 60, 70% of the adult population of the United States is not for repealing Roe v. Wade. So are they all ignorant and immoral and without morality? What would a wife of a pro-lifer say if she were raped and her husband said, you may not abort that? For the next 9 months, every day, every minute, every day, you must bear that fetus to grow in your womb. Does that sound like morality to you people? Not to allow abortion, seems to me, to be immoral. And like Scott, I look around the room and I see human beings. I don't see fetuses. I don't see fertilized eggs, and I don't see embryos. I see human beings. And not to just draw a distinction between a human being and a fertilized egg and an embryo and a fetus is, I don't understand how one can say that they are the same, that a human being begins with the egg. It is true you had a birthday. A birthday. You had a birthday. Did your fertilized egg have a birthday? The embryo stage, did the embryo have a birthday? Did the fetus have a birthday? No, you had a birthday. You are a human being. Your physical body began at conception with the sperm and the egg. Not you. Are you not just more than a physical body? The plausibility of the pro-life stance lies in the vocabulary to call a fertilized egg a human being, and certain amount of, I shouldn't say this, intellectual lack of sophistication, because there's a difference between a human being and a fertilized egg. And it isn't that a fertilized egg or an embryo or a fetus is preborn. It's unborn. It's an unborn. And you, when you're born, of course, you have a birthday. It's not true that you were separate from the time the fertilized egg was attached to the uterus. That's not true. If the fertilized egg detached from the uterus, it's flushed out in the menstrual stream. At no point when you were in the uterus, when your body was in the uterus, growing and developing, were you separate, as Scott claims. That simply is not true. At one point, Scott said the human being, and then he used the word person. I don't mean to accuse him of smuggling in the word person, but certainly that's what happened. He used the word person instead of human being. You wouldn't call a fertilized egg a person. You wouldn't call an embryo a person. You wouldn't call a fetus a person. You're a person. I'm a person. Scott's a person. Apparently there's something wrong in having, or immoral in having a idea that certain lives are more valuable than other lives. Well, I would say your life is more valuable than the life of a fetus. I would say your life is more valuable than an embryo. On the tip of this pin, there's a fertilized egg. Well, there isn't really, but imagine so. Is the life of this fertilized egg equal to your life as a person? Does that make sense to any of you? Apparently, it's immoral to believe that some lives are more valuable than others. Your lives, ladies and gentlemen, are more valuable than the life of this fertilized egg or embryo. Apparently, it's immoral to have a sliding scale of personhood. Is this fertilized egg a person? Is an embryo a person? Is a fetus a person? You're a person. I ask my students, are you more you now than you were 5 years ago? And they all say, of course I am. I'm 5 years older. I have 5 years more experience. I'm much more me than I was 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or if they're 20 years old, 20 years ago. What code of conduct, Scott asks, could allow an innocent and defenseless baby to be killed in the name of the convenience of woman? What code would say this is moral? Well, all pro-choice advocates would say the morality of terminating a pregnancy is not murder. It's terminating a pregnancy. Let's call it what it is. Terminating the development of a body, a physical body. If a woman wants an abortion, this history shows us that she's going to get an abortion. Do we want her lying in a tub of hot water with a coat hanger? Do we want her taking a bottle of laxatives? Do we want her throwing herself down steps so that she can have an abortion? My cousin, my sister-in-law worked in the ER. They saw women come in like that. Not to allow a woman to see a doctor is immoral. Is immoral. Now, let me lay out the... I don't have much time to do this. I want to try to use reason. I don't want to use the scriptures. I want to appeal to the values of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Men, not fetuses. That they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, or freedom, and the right to pursue happiness. These are American values. These are Western values. Not in Afghanistan, not in Malaysia, not in Indonesia, not anywhere in the Middle East, but in America. These values need to be defended. And if you support the prohibition of a woman over her body, if she has any property at all, it's her body. And for any legislature to take away that right to do with her body, her property, what she desires is simply immoral. I have a lot more to say, but do I have a minute?
You have 20 seconds.
This is Domestic Violence Month. You women know how men treat you. The Nobel Prize for Peace was given to a doctor in the Congo who sewed up the vagina of women who were raped in war. That's how men treat women. The girl who also was kidnapped by ISIS, raped. We gave the Nobel Prize to people like that.
Time. We'll now have the cross-examination of the affirmative by the negative. So Mr. Mahurin will be cross-examining Dr. Miller.
Great, thank you. John, it's good to be with you. Do you objectively, do you think it was objectively wrong for the people in the Congo to rip apart women's vaginas? Do you think it was objectively immoral?
Yes, absolutely.
And is that...
I shouldn't say absolutely, but yes.
Okay. And is that because the women that were raped were smaller than the people that were tearing them up?
No, it didn't have anything to do with their size. You're bigger than I am.
I am.
So let's not do size.
Okay. But what objectively was wrong with it? I mean, I agree with you. I share your outrage of
Well,
but what exactly was wrong with them being raped?
it obviously is not wrong in that culture. That's practice. It is a common practice in certain cultures to use rape as a method of warfare. But we in the West, since the Enlightenment, and that goes back to John Locke, 1632 to 1704, John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1883, and we're going back hundreds of years. In the West, we have had the Renaissance, humanism, Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And one of the values of the Enlightenment is freedom, and the value and respect for the individual,
Right.
not for a fetus, but for an individual. These are values that, from our perspective,
Right.
make the conduct of those soldiers and those with a gun in warfare to rape women immoral. From our perspective, not from theirs.
But you would argue that you would pause in saying it was absolutely wrong.
No, I stopped saying that.
Okay.
Because it's very hard to prove absolutes. It's very hard to defend absolutes. I did think about that. And, you know, for me, if there were one absolute value would be love. But we don't see love valued as an absolute anywhere. So although that would be my choice of an absolute,
Okay.
we don't see that. So I back off absolutes.
Fair enough. So a woman has the right not to, or the woman has a right to an abortion in your view. Where does the woman get those rights?
Well, there's a long history of morality, going in the rest going back to Pythagoras and Plato and so on. But from the Enlightenment on, from Descartes and John Locke particularly on, the body is property. The founding fathers said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because they were slaves. They couldn't say life, liberty, and property. But that's what John Locke said.
Okay.
Life, liberty, and property. So the body is a woman's property. Do they think that way in the Middle East? No. Do they think that way in Indonesia? No. Do they think that way in many places around the world? No, they don't.
Okay, so
what
if there's a body inside the body?
Well, there's a body inside the body. It's a body, but it's not the woman's body. Her body is that in which this other body exists.
Right. So
we're talking about the woman's, her body
right.
is her property.
And I wouldn't object to a woman getting surgery, getting a tooth pulled, getting her gallbladder out, getting whatever she would need medically. The issue is that there's another person. The reason pro-lifers are bent out of shape is that there's another person inside the mother's womb that needs to be legally protected too. Right?
What makes a person a person? Is a fertilized egg a person? Is a fetus a person? Is an embryo a person? Are these persons? Doesn't that stretch language to say they're persons? It's a developing human body. Not a kangaroo body, granted, not a walnut, but a developing human body. A developing human body, which may or may not develop.
Right. Especially if you care
It's
about
not a person.
But,
Not a person.
So I'm just trying to get at the relativism here. If it was 1840 and there was a bunch of abolitionists running around Florida saying we didn't have the right to own slaves, would you have agreed with them that we didn't have the right to own, that it was immoral to own another human being? Or would you have said, yeah, that's their culture, we should just, that's how they do things, and it's ugly, but...
Well,
can we object on any standard outside ourselves, besides ourselves?
Some of the most intelligent and moral and well-educated people, including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, the reason that all men are created equal." He had slaves. The first president of the United States, George Washington, whom we honor as the father of our nation, the general who defended us, allowed the colonies to become the United States. He had slaves. We're talking about good, intelligent, moral people. You're saying they weren't intelligent, they weren't moral because they had slaves?
No, I'm saying was it immoral for them to own them? Was it something that they shouldn't have done?
It's easy for us looking back. But if you and I lived at that time, we may very well have had slaves. So I am not going to say that it was immoral. No, I'm not, Scott. I'm not going to say it was immoral for them to have slaves.
What if there was a culture like, I don't have a lot of time. Actually, I'll wait. So, thank you.
It'll be time for Scott's negative constructive.
Is that right?
Yes, and then you get to ask me after that. I'll be ready though. All right. In this section of the debate, I'd like to construct the heart of the pro-life argument. John has done a pretty good job of it, but I will rehabilitate some of that. All human beings have the right to life. Conception is when the life of a human being begins. So conception is when the right to life is given. Therefore, preborn babies must be given the right to life. The logic flows. Now, all finite things have a beginning and an end. Human beings are finite. We all agree when life ends. The beginning of life, we can just as easily figure out. Because there was a time in which you did not exist. And now you do. And then eventually you won't. Hopefully not for a while, but eventually you won't exist. With the first two premises that we established, that human beings have this right to life, and I'll add the word, if he can't add it, I'll add it, absolutely. Conception, that human beings have an absolute right to life, and that conception begins a human life. It necessarily follows that at conception, humans are given the right to life. And these rights must be protected. Now, I promised John I would not quote a bunch of Bible verses as proof text for my argument. I will, however, mention one Bible verse. It's a big one. Whether or not you read the Bible or not, you like this verse. You love it. It's your favorite verse. Especially if anyone has ever tried to kill you or murder you. You may have quoted this verse to them. Exodus 20:10. You shall not murder. Okay? Most religions and morality are pretty well centered in that one. That's like the eye, when you go to the eye doctor, that's the big E on the eye chart. Like, pretty good at that one. And we should not murder because human beings have value. God created us with value. If you object to the language of a God creating you, then I would just simply ask, where do values come from? Do they come from society? Do they come from the Constitution? Do you give yourself values? Where do they come from? If God did not create us, then we do not have value. Or to put it another way, your existence is subject to competing values. And sadly, since abortion has been legal for 45 years, you might one day have to justify your existence on the basis of these competing values. Relativism always leads to a power struggle. Okay? If you have siblings, raise your hand if you have siblings. If you have siblings, you know what I'm talking about. Mom and dad are gone, what happens? Might makes right. It is on. Who's in charge? Whoever's biggest. My sister is 5 years older than me, and she beat the tar out of me incessantly. So if you don't like me so far, you're in good company. Relativism always leads to a power struggle. Who says? The stronger always wins. The voice of power then becomes the voice of morality. If you're familiar with the book Lord of the Flies, you know what I'm talking about. That's what that book is about. It's illustrating the idea that might makes right. Pro-choice advocates argue that the fetus or baby is just a clump of cells. It's just a bunch of stuff. But by doing so, they're arguing that clumps of cells do not have any rights. Right? If they said, it's not a person, it's just a clump of cells, what they're implicitly saying is, it's not that clumps of cells don't have any rights. Okay, fine. But if there's no God, we don't bear the image of God, and if there's no God, we're all just clumps of cells. Some big, some small, some old, some young, some male, some female, and the struggle is real. Okay? To the science. The sperm and the egg unite, and there's a new living human being. A baby is not just a product of conception, but it is a human being. We will talk more about that, I'm sure. We all are people. We're both, all of us are products of conception. We're just older and less cute than you were when you were just beginning. John and I are both products of conception. We're also less cute than when we were babies, though I do submit that he is cuter than me. Genetic information is imprinted on the fetus at conception. So when that moment happens, the preborn, the baby, has every body part potentially that it will ever have. It's imprinted in the DNA. And so 18 days after you were conceived, you had a heartbeat. 21 days after you were conceived, your heart was pumping blood through its tiny body. 28 days after conception, you had budding arms and legs. 30 days after conception, you had multiplied 10,000 times since conception. 35 days after conception, your mouth, ears, and nose take shape. 40 days, brain waves are detected. A new living human being is created at conception because something non-human cannot become human later on. Something non-human, if it's just a bunch of cells, it can't ultimately become a human later. It has to be what it was from the beginning. That's the way we scientifically explain the origins of anything, really, in science. No offense to John's biology friends and zoology professors, but it's not a consensus view by any stretch in the medical community. There are lots and lots of professors who would argue that are also secular, that have nothing to do with the Christian faith, that life begins at conception. I'll name three. Bradley Patton from University of Michigan, Keith Moore, University of Toronto, and Edith Potter at the University of Minnesota. They're not biology teachers from, Billy Bob Christian Academy. These are well-documented researchers at secular universities who've written embryology textbooks. Being inside of something, and I may have misspoken, I'll clarify this. Being inside of something is not the same as being part of something. So if you're inside your house and your house burns down, you don't burn down unless you're in there. You're different from your surroundings. So the moment you were conceived, yes, you were inside your mother's womb, but you were, by definition, a separate person from your mother, a separate individual from your mother. And that's the whole point of the pro-life argument. That's the whole point of the pro-life issue. Proving they're different people. A child may die, a mother may miscarry, the mother may be in an accident, the mother may die and the child may live, or vice versa. They're separate individuals. The science that we've talked about is not necessarily, thank you, the science that we've talked about is good, but it does not necessarily lead us to morality. Science can tell us that a baby is a human being, but only morality can tell us to preserve it, or her. Morality is based in metaphysics, in other words, something that's beyond ourselves. If it is not based on metaphysics, something that's pressing down on all of us, like for instance a God, then might makes right, and we're all just in the conflict together. If we do not recognize and protect the personhood of the preborn as a separate human being and person, and therefore entitled to the same rights as others, therefore, if we do not do that, society will struggle to find a standard for other human beings to protect. Viability, race, usefulness and benefit to society, IQ, sentience, gender, nationality, or something else. The human race has been horrible at this throughout history, so we should protect the preborn from the moment of conception.
Time.
We will now have the cross-examination of Mr. Mahurin by Dr. Miller.
Scott, you said that science can tell us that the human being begins at conception. The potential for the fertilized egg to become a human being, of course that's true. And if by human life you mean the fertilized egg, of course that's where life begins. But is there not a distinction between the human being and a person? And this, you keep saying over and over and over, you did not exist until you were conceived. Maybe you did. I don't want to get into reincarnation and the pre-existence of the soul like St. Augustine believed, and many Christians believe, that the soul is immortal and pre-exists coming into a physical body. Is that something that you would accept, Scott?
That the soul pre-exists?
That the soul pre-exists coming into the body?
I'm not sure.
Not sure, all right.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we shouldn't abort babies, though.
I shouldn't abort a baby, but it's not a baby in the fetus. It is a fertilized egg. It is an embryo. It is a fetus. It's not a baby. My pen. This is not a baby. Where's my pen go? This is not a baby. This little fertilized egg is not a baby. Stop saying it's a baby. That just defies language to say that a fertilized egg is a baby, or even an embryo is a baby, or a fetus is a baby. And you keep saying that over and over and over again. You cite Exodus,
Right.
the idea that God says we should not murder. The same God that gave the Ten Commandments ordered the Hebrews to kill the Palestinians. Now, of course, if God orders you to do it, if God orders you to murder, then it's not murder. If God orders you to steal, then it's not stealing. If God orders you to commit adultery, it's not adultery. This is a question theologians have struggled with.
Can I have a crack at it?
Please.
Yes, God did say that, and God did order that the Canaanites be wiped out off the face of the earth when God told them to go in and take their land and conquer them. That's in the Bible. I'm not going to argue with that. One of the main reasons, I might hasten to add, that God wanted the Canaanites to be destroyed was because they practiced child sacrifice. They took babies that were born and they would throw them into fire, sacrificing them to the god Moloch. And so God said, yes, go wipe those people out. He's God. He gets to tell us what to do. I don't have any objection to that.
So that means that there are reasons and justifications for murdering.
Well, no. I would put that in the categories of war. I think when it was a war, it was an invasion, it was a war. I don't think God's a pacifist.
So war is all right.
There are just wars. I think that would qualify under the just war doctrine. You mentioned Augustine. I think he may have mentioned it. But I think that's an okay, it's not a sin for a Christian to join the military and do that. I don't think so. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned slavery earlier.
Right.
St. Paul talks about how we should treat our slaves. The Southerners would cite Scripture as justification for having slaves. They were Bible-believing Christians, and they quoted Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, for justification for slavery. But slavery, everybody had slaves back then. It was part of the consciousness of the people. People in the Old Testament had slaves. St. Paul talks about how you should treat your slaves. So slavery was not a moral issue that it becomes later on. So the same God that orders you not to murder orders the killing of the Canaanites. God ordered Saul to wipe out the enemy. Saul said, no, that's men, women, and children? No, I don't think so. He said, all right, I'll put this shepherd, David, as king. And he said to David, you do it. And David said, that's not moral. That's not moral. So he put Solomon in. I don't know whether Solomon did or not, but by that time, maybe God was running out of people to make that the other kind. The point is that there's a lot of moral acts that we consider immoral that are perfectly permitted to the God of the Old Testament, including the stoning of women to death. Look at Leviticus. I should have my reference here. I don't. But is that justified?
No. And
God says to do it?
Yeah.
I'd rather think that it wasn't that God said to do it.
Sure.
I'd rather think that the people thought that's what God wanted them to do. Did that make sense?
It did. Yeah, I think we've gone a little bit off the topic, but I was happy to talk about it a little bit. I think Old Testament law, ceremonial law, things about cleanliness and all those things, and most of that law was fulfilled in Christ, was fulfilled when Jesus came. And so the reason we don't execute people or throw big rocks at homosexuals or stone adulterers anymore is because Jesus Christ came to fulfill the law. And so the reason we don't have those kind of ceremonial things anymore is because Jesus came. We're in the New Testament now, we're in AD. So we don't do that anymore. So that would be one objection, one answer for you. The other thing, again, would be the idea of war, that theologians talk about just war doctrine, that there's a time when a nation can, or a people can defend themselves as an extension of self-defense. Like if someone comes up to me and starts punching me, I have the right to defend myself. And you extend that out to nations, they have the right to defend themselves too. So that's what I would mention there.
Time.
Well, I wanted to talk about a little bit about what John had mentioned at the beginning, which was, and throughout, this idea that skepticism regarding when life begins or what kind of life. My answer to that would be simple, that if there is any uncertainty about when human life should begin, like if I just put all the cards down on the table and say, okay, I'll grant your point, it's just a clump of cells, we're not sure what it is. Well then, shouldn't the benefit of the doubt go to waiting until we find out what's going on? Shouldn't the benefit of the doubt go to preserving something and not destroying it? I grew up, as Josh mentioned, in Idaho, and like all boys in Idaho, I went hunting on occasion. And when I was 13, I took a hunter safety class. And one of the basic rules of hunter safety is this. If you're not sure what you're shooting at, don't shoot. Right? If you're not sure what you're shooting at, don't shoot. Don't shoot if you just hear the bushes rustling and you know there's something in there, so you just fire away. It might be your partner. It might be an animal you're not supposed to hunt. It's common sense. If we're not sure when life begins, we should wait and investigate until we are sure. But apparently we don't want to do that. What if the baby is unwanted or unplanned? Yes, there are unwanted pregnancies. Some of you might have been unwanted pregnancies. Some of you might have been unplanned pregnancies. I won't ask for a show of hands. And while I would argue that John would never do this, I would say that your unwantedness probably is far more expensive now than it was when you were a baby. And so I'm glad you've survived this long. Anyway. This does not change the fundamental fact that children need protection. They need legal protection. Unplanned does not equal unnecessary. Inconvenient does not mean immoral. Unwanted means a very specific definition for unwanted. Unwanted means the parents don't want the child. That doesn't mean no one wants the child. You see that? It doesn't mean no one wants the child. It means they don't. So when my ministry, I go to abortion clinics and I help out. I reach out with women to women to try to help them, to try to direct them to pro-life pregnancy centers. One of the things I say all the time when they say, well, I don't want this baby, I say, I do. I want your baby. I will help take care of your baby. I know people who can help you take care of your baby. You do not have to have an abortion. We talked about different issues. One of the things that will come up, I'm sure, will these exceptions. We talked about the idea of rape. If my wife were raped, or if a pro-life activist wife were raped, well, I would think that whoever the pro-life activist might be, that the pro-life activist would know enough to know that you don't punish the baby for the sins of the father. So if a pro-life, if a woman were raped and becomes pregnant, you don't punish the baby, you punish the rapist. If you don't punish the creepy uncle who impregnated her, or you do punish him, I'm sorry. You punish the creepy uncle who impregnated her, you don't punish the baby. There are families ready and able to adopt and desiring to adopt any child who has been conceived at any time. The ancient Romans had a tradition of exposing their deformed or sickly infants. If a baby was born with some type of physical disability, they were left out in the elements, exposed in a field, and left to die. Early Christians would go to these fields and often try to nurse these babies back to health. The Romans hated the Christians for this practice because they believed that a person only had worth if he or she could benefit society. In the lunches that we've had, John and I talked about John Stuart Mill. I remember reading John Stuart Mill in college and having to go really slow because John Stuart Mill is smart and I am not. But the questions that I always have about utilitarian arguments are, if a person is only useful, only has worth if and when they are useful and beneficial to society, who determines the usefulness? Who determines the benefit to society? And why is the usefulness and benefit useful and beneficial? The question is, should everyone who's not useful and beneficial to society, depending on the definition, should all of them be destroyed? Or just the smallest, most vulnerable? We talked about women's health and women's poverty and all these things. The issue at hand, again, a human being is made in God's image. There are times that a baby is born into or is conceived into very difficult situations. Maybe a woman is addicted to drugs and the baby has some effects from it. But this never justifies the intentional destruction of a human life. Because a baby is a human being made in God's image who's done nothing to justify its death. We all have lots of things passed on from our parents that we get, some good, some bad. And again, do all drug addicts deserve the death penalty? Just the addicts? Because they're a drain on resources, because they're It's a difficult situation. You know, can't really hold down a job, can't really pay taxes. I mean, why are they still alive too? Are we going to protect them? Or are we going to destroy them? Or are we going to destroy just the littlest ones? When it comes to the life of the mother, former Surgeon General C. Everett Koop famously said he could not recall one instance where a mother's life had to be saved by aborting their unborn child. Not one instance in over 40 years of medical practice. Koop stopped practicing medicine in the 80s, over 30 years ago. Since then, medical technology has evolved to the point where babies can survive up to 20 to 21 weeks premature. There's a friend of mine at my church named William Ciccone who comes to the clinic with me and plays guitar, and he was born 20 weeks premature. Is his life not worth as much as others? Medical technology is now at the point where a severely ill pregnant woman need not even consider ending the life of her preborn baby in order to save her own life. These cases are incredibly rare, and if and when they occur, we should try to save both mother and child. Further, how much time?
We got 1 minute.
Awesome. Whether a woman is poor or financially needy is another situation that we will probably talk about and get to. This exception it doesn't really work. Financial wealth and the humanity of a person are not related at all. If anything, this question actually reveals a lot more about how our culture values wealth and status over life. What about other poor people outside of the womb? Do they matter? Are they useful, beneficial? Do they deserve to live? Who says? Again, if there's no God, who says? But back to the point again. There's help available for each of these situations that we are discussing tonight. I am a full-time pro-life minister. I have lots of people, lots of contacts, pro-life pregnancy centers, churches, other nonprofits, whose mission involves this very thing. Like I mentioned, John is my friend, and I do not believe that he is a bad person. However, he is arguing from a principle that is allowing all of us to be unprotected, because he is allowing for the principle that says certain people are not worth as much as others. As Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Time. We'll now have the affirmative rebuttal by Dr. Miller.
Imagine a young man, drug dealer, shot, needing a heart, and he comes into the ER. And it just happened that 10 minutes earlier, there was a motorcyclist who was killed, and the heart is available, and it's a match. As they wheel this gentleman into the ER, a surgeon on the 3rd floor has a heart attack. This surgeon has spent his life saving people, doing heart surgery. The heart is right down, 2 stories below. Is there no difference between the life of a surgeon whose life is dedicated to saving lives and this young drug dealer who was shot because he was involved in a gang warfare that takes the lives of people? Are these 2 lives the same? Are they of the same value? It seems to me not to see that there's a difference in value in human life. It's simply not to see something that should, to my way of thinking, be obvious. Do we have the right to choose for other people? Or should, as my friend Beverly, whom I communicate, she's in New Mexico, she said, you know, that we shouldn't judge. My sister-in-law and my cousin, who are both nurses, my sister-in-law said, I've never been part of a delivery, I've never helped a delivery where tears didn't come to my eyes. It's such a beautiful, maybe a sacred thing. But, she said, having a woman come off the street, having put a coat hanger up her vagina, that's worse. It's worse not to allow a woman to have an abortion. It should be, some women have told me, between the woman and her doctor. A friend of mine in Oregon, whose minister said, in the final analysis, it should be between the woman and God, not legislatures, made up of largely old white men. John Stuart Mill wrote a book, the most powerful book on freedom. It's called On Liberty. He said, the only freedom that deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not hinder others in their pursuit of freedom or impede their efforts to obtain it. That book, written by John Stuart Mill, say around 1850, 1950, 2000, 150 years, that has been the value in the West. Freedom, the right of the individual to do what he or she wants, so long as he or she does not harm another individual. But a fertilized egg, an embryo, a fetus is not an individual human being, not a separate human being. Not a separate human being. Scott kept using the word children, the idea that we shouldn't punish the child for what happens to the mother. Children need protection. Yes, children need protection, but not fertilized eggs or embryos or fetuses. I applaud Scott and his group for saying, I want the baby, preserve the baby, but then provide the means of doing that. That's important to do that. Scott said if we can't know when a human being begins, then we should treat the fertilized egg as a human being. I say the burden of proof lies on the pro-lifers to somehow show that a fertilized egg is a human being. It's a human, potential human being, but a potential human being isn't a human being. My students are potential graduates. Are they graduates? No, if they were graduates, they wouldn't be in my class. They're potential graduates. A potential graduate is not a graduate. A potential human being is not a human being. Doesn't that make logical sense? If I have to argue that you women in the audience are more valuable than a fertilized egg, and if that argument doesn't seem commonsensical to you, I don't know what to say. Because to me, that seems a perfectly reasonable and logical thing to say. It seems more reasonable to me to say, and to pro-choice people, that the right of a woman to her body, to her health, and in some cases to her life, is more important than the life of a fertilized egg or an embryo or even a fetus. Even if that fetus is viable, if it were taken out of the uterus. So, let's not go backwards, ladies. Let's not repeal Roe v. Wade. Who gives you the right to have an abortion? The state gives you the right to have an abortion. Not God, not Scott, not me. The state. There was a time when a woman was not allowed to have an abortion. Now she does have an abortion. We need to defend that right. We need to defend the idea that a woman's body is her most intimate property. You have a car, you paid for it, you have a title. You have a house, you have a title. Someone gives you a Christmas gift, you don't like it, you can give it to the Salvation Army. Right? Why? Because it's yours. It's yours. What makes it yours? What makes your body yours? I mean, what a ridiculous question. What makes your body yours? We hold these truths to be self-evident to reason. If it's not reasonable to claim that a woman's body is her property, her possession, hers, then there's no talking. Then there's no dialogue. Then there's really no debate.
Cross-examination of the negative by the affirmative. Dr. Miller, your turn.
You got a question? You can ask me questions now.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, my cross-examination from you.
Yeah, then I can ask you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Scott, what, you use the word child when you're talking about a fetus.
Little.
You did, I mean, I paid very close attention
I
to
did.
what you said. You used the word child.
Right.
You use the word baby when the proper word would be fetus or embryo or fertilized egg.
Right. Well,
That's
that seems to
smuggling in
that seems
the
to
very
baffle.
thing that's a question.
You see.
Is the fertilized egg a baby? Is the fertilized egg a child?
Right.
And you go from saying this is the beginning of human life, all right, human life as a physical form,
Yeah.
but you several times smuggled in the word child. A child should be defended, right? A child should be protected.
Right.
A baby should be protected.
Yes.
Do you not see a difference between a fertilized egg and a baby and a child, a uterus?
Right.
Uterus. An embryo and a child,
Agree
a
with you.
fetus and a child. Do you not see a difference there?
I see a difference in size.
That's it.
No, just give me a minute.
Watch
I don't have a
watch this one size.
I don't have a PhD, John. I'm trying to keep up here. All right. I see a difference in size, but that doesn't mean I see a difference in worth. We have all the stuff, all the DNA is there at the moment of conception. So what is that? What is that? Well, that's a microscopic human being.
No. DNA.
Right.
DNA is not a human being.
Right, but all the stuff is there.
Potential. But as I say, is a potential
Right.
graduate a graduate? Is a potential human being a human being? Analogously, the answer is no. A potential human being is a potential human
Right.
being and not a human being. And it's not a child and it's not a baby. Where does the right of a fertilized egg come from? Where does the right of an embryo to develop into a fetus come from? Where does the right of a fetus to develop all the way through come from? Where does that right come from?
I would argue it comes from "you shall not murder," that we have the right to life. I would argue that it comes from the Constitution, that we're not to deny anybody life without due process. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are valued. You mentioned them in your stuff about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. I agree 100%. So if you don't agree with the Bible's rendering of "you shall not murder," then you should agree with just the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, who say that we should protect life. That's where those rights come from.
But these are lives of a human being, not the life of a fertilized egg. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the life of a fertilized embryo, the fertilized egg,
Right.
or embryo has the right to life. Nothing says that. Nothing. Nowhere
Right. Well,
can you see anything remotely like that. So why point to the Constitution?
well, because it mentions denying due process of the 14th Amendment. And you may not deprive the right to life of anyone without due process. So the question would be, why are millions of children aborted without due process? What crime did they commit?
You keep going back and calling fetus a person, embryo a person. I see no reason to do that. What makes you and me a person? What makes us different from your dog or your cat or a mouse or an amoeba? Three things. Number one, our intelligence. Our intelligence. Maybe the brain hasn't even developed to the prefrontal cortex in the uterus. Second thing that makes us different from the animals is that we're moral creatures. Because we can reason, we understand that certain things are right and wrong. We can perceive the consequences of our action. And if our consequences of our action are going to hurt someone, then we realize that intuitively, maybe there's something in us that makes us realize that harming another, if we wouldn't like it, the golden rule is universal. Go back to Egypt, go back to China, go back to India, go back to any religion. The golden rule is universal. Do not do to others what you would not have done to you. That's a universal moral belief.
Unless you're
Not that it's practiced. Well, I can give you the quotes from Egypt and China and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam. I can give you those quotes because I give them to my students every semester. Those are universal. And so, we understand that we shouldn't do to others what we wouldn't want done to us. The fact that we're moral is what makes us human beings. And the third thing that makes us a human being is, am I done?
No, you got a little while.
The third thing that makes a human being is that we respond to beauty, art, music, poetry, literature, sculpture, cathedrals, mosques. We're rational, we're moral, we respond to beauty. A fertilized egg does none of that, an embryo does none of that, and a fetus does none of that. In what sense do they have the value that you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, have?
Okay, well, now I get to ask you. So, all right. John, if God forbid, on the way out tonight, as you're walking out to your car, someone tackles you and starts cutting off your arms and legs, would that be immoral?
For any number of reasons.
I'm not insinuating anything. Yeah, by the way, I would totally stand up for you. You said it's because it causes harm, right?
I'm sorry?
Because it would one of the reasons be it causes harm?
Yes.
Physical pain?
Harm and to a human being.
Right.
Yes.
So what if they did it when you were 10 years old? Would that still be wrong?
That would still be harm because I would be a human being.
Okay.
A young human being, but still a human being.
But are you worth more now or then?
Absolutely, I'm worth more now.
You are?
I've lived 70 years, I've learned more, I've become more of what a human being should be in terms of intelligence, in terms of morality, in terms of appreciation of beauty, absolutely.
So what if you were, so you see where I'm going.
I see where you're going.
What if you were in the hospital? Now, you were born, you were outside your mother's womb, and you were crying. Well, would it be immoral for someone to say to someone to start cutting you into pieces? Would that be immoral?
That would be immoral because I would have been born and I would be a baby.
Day one. Okay. Now let's go a little further back. What about the day before you were born?
I am not born.
So
okay. My body is still in the uterus.
Right, but you would feel excruciating pain.
My body would. My body would respond. I don't know that I would. Depends upon how far developed my brain is.
Okay. So it wouldn't be immoral. Would it be immoral or not to cut you up into pieces as a 1 day, 8 months and 29 days?
Well, look, I said at the beginning, it would be a much better world if we didn't have to have abortions. It would be a much better world, and I would agree that at some point when the fetus is truly viable, then that
Sure.
we should be restrictions on that. That makes perfectly good sense to rational people. If the fetus is viable, the fetus has developed to the point where it can live outside of
Which again, for most people is depending. I was a I am a male, and I was a boy. And for many years, I was a really, really stupid boy. And I don't know how viable I was, maybe even age 20.
That's what I'm saying to my students. You got more youth than you were 10 years ago.
Right, well, right, but I would say I couldn't do anything by myself at 20. Now, I'm being a little facetious. I thought it's funny, as you get older, you think, when I was 20, I felt older than I feel now. But I am way, anyway. So you're back inside the womb, your body would feel pain, but that doesn't make it immoral. Now, you mentioned that so you would agree that there should be restrictions on late-term abortion?
I would not object to that, absolutely. And in fact, I would be in favor of that when the fetus has developed to the point where it's viable and can breathe on its own. We'll talk about that a little later, because the breath you have to have lungs, and the lungs are the last organ to develop.
Right.
And so, you can't breathe if you don't have lungs.
Right.
And so, lungs are important. Breathing is important. The Greek word for soul is psyche, which means breath, or pneuma, which means breath.
Right. But anyone here that's had children, I've had 3 daughters, and when we brought them home from the hospital, they were very unviable. They weren't able to do anything by themselves. And I tried. I showed them the kitchen. I said, tested my oldest. She just turned 16. I said, if you want food, go get up and get it. Maybe I started looking for jobs for her to do. And anyway, not really, of course. And but viability, I mean, how that could be any time, right, John? I mean, can survive
No, it can't be any time.
survive on its
It can't be any time.
survive on its own. I mean, when do we survive on its own? Childhood, potty training, school, intelligence. You talk about intelligence. But anyway, do you know Peter Singer? That name? You know that.
I don't know him personally, but I've read his book.
Okay.
Situation Wax.
Yeah, exactly. Do you like him?
I understand his point of view.
Okay.
Whether
So,
I like him or not.
well, okay. I meant, do you like his point of view? Or actually, before you answer that, let me explain. Peter Singer is a philosophy professor from Princeton, I think, right? Princeton. And he is not only pro-choice, he believes that families should have the right to take their baby home for 30 days, have like a 30-day waiting period, after it's born, whether or not they want the baby to survive or not. So if it's really cramping their style to be parents, they don't have to have a habit anymore. They can just have the baby.
They have to keep it. He's not advocating killing it.
Well, but that's one of the choices, as he said, that it's his infanticide. So what do you think of that? He's not viable yet. He's not 30 days old.
Well, he is viable. We're obfuscating on the word viable. Viable means that you can breathe and you can function and so on like that. Not go to the cupboard and pull out a jar of peanut butter and fix yourself a peanut butter sandwich. That's not what viable means, and you know that. That's obfuscating, misusing the word. When we say a fetus is viable, we mean something different from going to the store or going to the bathroom by yourself or going to fix a sandwich for yourself. We don't mean that.
There'll be time.
It was sanctioned by the law. We used to have segregation. It was sanctioned by the law. Consciousness changes over time. The God of the Old Testament is not the God of Exodus, and the early writing is not the God of the prophets. Consciousness changes. Our understanding of everything changes. So our moral consciousness changes. It changes over time. And, okay, that's point number one. There's a scale of values. People who are more educated, people who are more educated are more valuable than their pets, perhaps. We draw distinctions. Some cars are better than others. Some meals are better than others. Some music is better than others. Some pets are better. Some people have better education than others. So we draw distinctions all the time. The scale of value, I'm perfectly willing to admit. I would say an infant is less valuable than a teenager. Because a teenager has experience. The teenager has learned not quite to develop the full mentality because the brain still develops until age 21 or 22. That's why we make allowances in the law. But in terms of their value, certainly an older than a teenager, a young adult would be more valuable. When does a person become wise? At age 10, 20, 30? Wisdom is different from knowledge. And people become wise only by having a lot of experience. And they become more themselves. The body is not a person. The fertilized egg is not a person. The embryo is not a person. There's a difference between an animal and a human being. The brain develops, the embryo develops, the fetus develops. God talked about the Bible. Human beings become a living soul. The second chapter of Genesis, verse 7, if you want to do the religion. And God took dust of the ground, and He formed it, and He breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. So those nostrils had to be formed. Those lungs had to be formed. And what makes a living being is not the body. The body you can keep alive. You can put a body on a machine. We have technology now, I guess, to keep the body alive relatively indefinitely. Terry Schreiber. You keep the body alive, the brain can utterly disintegrate. There can be no brain. When they did an autopsy of her body, there was virtually no brain. Is that a human being lying there in the bed? No, it's not a human being. What makes a human being, if you want to do the religious worldview, is a soul. Genesis said, and man became a living soul. Soul is that breath. When you die, out goes your breath. When you are born, in comes the breath. Maybe the soul, maybe, who knows, but maybe the soul comes in at the time of the first breath. I have a student named Ileana Jones. She works in a fertility clinic. When women come in, they take their eggs, they fertilize their eggs, they freeze the eggs. After about 5 days, they do a chromosomal examination to see if there are any deformations. After 4 weeks, they do it again. Are there any chromosomal aberrations? If there are, they let the eggs thaw. Are we going to accuse the doctors and people who work in fertility clinics of murder because they let a fertilized egg thaw and die? Does that make sense to you? A body lying in a coma. Does that make sense to say that flat-lined brain is a human being? To conclude, a human being is a human being, not a fertilized egg. A human being is a human being, not an embryo. A human being is a human being, not a fetus. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who dealt with people who were dying, there are books, many books by physicians on what happens when we die. When we die, the body may be alive, but the we goes on. Study the literature on near-death experience and so on. What we should be doing is giving, and Scott, I know, is part of this, to give loving counsel to these women who are making the difficult decision. And it is difficult. It's not done lightly to end a pregnancy. The difficult decision of whether or not to end a pregnancy. But by all means, we should not make the woman feel guilty. There was a book written by a lady who was a teenager. She was so religious. She joined an evangelical group of adolescents that abstinence. And they made her feel so guilty. And they made her hate the way her body was so much that she developed PTSD. And some of those girls in that movement committed suicide. We don't want that. There are 4 reasons that we are here. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, people who have died and come back, said, number 1, we're here to love unconditionally. That includes a pregnant woman. We're here to be of service to others. We're here to develop our talents and abilities and help and encourage others to do the same. On a lighter note, I'm reminded of the play by the Greek comic poet Aristophanes. The play is called Lysistrata. The men are all fighting and the women don't want them to fight. You know how they get them to stop? By withholding sex. You want Roe v. Wade kept as it is? You women have the power. Withhold sex. I thank you.
Time.
I'd like to thank everybody for their time and attention. John, thank you very much. And we're still friends. I want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, but I do have several points to make in summary. At the beginning of the debate, I said that John had conceded it just by coming to argue for this position that abortion is morally acceptable. Tonight I argued that morality has to come from outside of ourselves. At times John quoted scripture, at times he didn't. He quoted it and then said he didn't believe it because he doesn't like the God of the Bible or doesn't agree with the morality of the God of the Bible. And that's his right. But that just illustrates my point, that we have to look to a consistent source for where our morality comes from, because if we just argue among each other, it just might makes right. I'd like to illustrate this coincidentally by making an observation about some of you in the audience tonight. Some of you here with the shirts that say not their issue, I'd like to welcome you. Please stay for Q&A. I'd love to talk more with you. I appreciate that all of you came to this debate. I appreciate your attention and your activism and your politeness in listening quietly. As a professional activist myself, I spend a lot of my time showing up to things with shirts too, and making a public stand on stuff. I get it, I understand it, and thank you very much. You did, however, assume that we were males. I don't know if that's a big deal or not. But you assumed we were men. You just assumed by looking at us, I guess, and we are. But so we.
Conceded it in an interview as well.
I did it in an interview. That's right. I know. I gave too much away. I think your presence here tonight actually proves my point better than I ever could have. I do not wish to be unkind or to come across as harsh. I know you all are sincere. Your shirts and your statements you're making illustrate what I'm saying. If the rights of the vulnerable among us are threatened, the rights of all of us are threatened. If we as a society cannot determine that a preborn baby is a human being, then if we cannot protect their existence by law, all of us are in danger of having our rights taken away. You're saying that because I'm a man, that I have no right to speak on this issue. Because John is a man, he has no right to speak on this issue, even though I think he did a pretty good job. It's interesting to me that you all didn't show up to root for John, since he argued for that position, but you chose a position that actually discriminates against both of us for our genitalia, of all things. Because we are men, we cannot speak about this issue. Therefore, you're discriminating against men. You might say, yes, but men don't count in this discussion, and we just ask that you not speak about it. Okay, well then you're dehumanizing us too. You're silencing us because of what? Who we are. That's the very definition of discrimination. You're arguing from a principle that allows for injustice to continue. This same principle could be applied. Again, apply the principle. The principle could be applied if we were black in the pre-Civil War South, if we were Native Americans on the Trail of Tears, if we were elderly, if we were disabled, if we were Jewish and put in Hitler's ghettos in Poland. if we were a little girl in China during the one-child policy. Each of those issues that I just mentioned have their own protest. But wait, you don't like slavery? It's not your business what a slave owner does with his slaves. The exact same position could be taken logically. It's not my business what happens in Germany. I'm not German. I'm not, and I'll get to your questions afterwards, I promise. If you don't like the Trail of Tears and Native Americans getting kicked off their land, if you're not a landowner in the South, it's not your place to tell them anything is wrong. Oddly, and if you'll indulge me just briefly, injustices have to be fought and won by people who often have no personal stake in the outcome. The Civil War was won, why? Because hundreds of thousands of white men gave their lives to free the slaves, many of whom had never seen a black person. World War II was fought and won by millions of men who had no existential interest in the places they were fighting, could not speak their languages, and understood little or nothing of the cultures that they were in. But they understood this, that evil is real and it must be destroyed. When we leave any member of our society without legal protection, we leave them at the mercy of evil, ambitious politicians and rulers. We've heard about Roe versus Wade tonight, and that's perfectly fine. It's his right to advocate for that. But what Roe versus Wade has actually said, and why Roe versus Wade is important, is that if personhood of the baby can be established, that's what Harry Blackmun, the lead judge on that, 1973 said, if the personhood of the baby is established by law, all these other rights, all these other circumstances fade away. Well, in 1973, they didn't have ultrasounds. In 1973, they didn't have near the technology that we have now that can determine when these things happen. And so that's important to remember. And you might say, well, wait a minute. We're not here to dehumanize anyone. We're not here to silence anyone. We're just here to speak our piece about the abortion issue. Perfectly fine. But what standard are you using? Are you using the same standard that when it's your time to be dehumanized, it's your time to defend your own rights? Is someone going to stand up for you? Either might makes right. Either we're back at home with our siblings and parents went away for a few hours and might makes right, and you've got Lord of the Flies and it is on in society and we're bickering and fighting with each other, and hey, there's no image of God here. Why not? We're all just big clumps of cells oppressing other clumps of cells, and who cares? What difference does it make? Don't tell me God's involved, because that sounds religious language and that doesn't make any sense to me. But just listen real close. The moral force of the argument compels us to be against abortion and to define it at the beginning, and to define human life at the beginning of conception. Time. What happens when your rights are at the mercy of those who would dehumanize you? What happens when the same principle, when the same premise is used against you? When you're old and can't walk? Now John says he's more valuable at 80 than he was at 10. Well, what if someone doesn't agree with that? What if your health care gets rationed because you're too old and you're not useful and beneficial enough? Who's going to stand up for you? When you can't control your bladder anymore and you're pooping in your pants and your children need to take care of you, but you're too inconvenient and expensive, so they ship you off to a death camp for the elderly, who's going to take care of you? Who will stand for you when you must justify your existence? As George Orwell said in his book Animal Farm, we are all equal, but some are more equal than others. And that is exactly what John has said throughout this debate. He has said that there are people who are worth more than other people. He has said that that's based on lots of factors. IQ, education, intelligence, age, he said, which I thought was interesting. But we are now in the place, in the United States, where some are more human, in fact, than others. Thank you all. If abortion is not immoral, nothing is. Thank you.
As I said at the beginning, we would love to get through as many questions as possible, so please keep them succinct. I will bring the microphone around to anyone who has a question if they'll raise their hand. And while I walk, I'll throw one out there to John as a starter. Last year, scientists in 2 separate facilities were able to bring a lamb that was halfway through gestation to full term. If this technology is eventually applicable to humans, and much earlier, would it be permissible for a state to ban abortion and also fully subsidize such a procedure as an alternative?
Well, a lamb is a mammal, but a lamb does not have the prefrontal cortex that makes a human being in the sense of the level of rationality, the capacity for morality, and the appreciation and execution of beauty. So lambs are lambs and human beings are different.
It's that whole God's image thing again.
Sorry?
It's that whole God's image thing again, right? That's one of the differences. We'll talk about it.
My question/comment is directed at you.
Yes.
So I just wanted to say that as a man, you do have a stake in this issue. However, it does come down to a matter of bias and perspective. As we saw in this debate, we spent at least 80% of the time establishing when a human was a human rather than speaking about the woman's rights involved in abortion. And furthermore, you do not have to go directly through an at-home abortion if you do not have a legal access to one or the after effects involved. So that is just what we had to say about not being women in this debate because we didn't speak about their issues. And so furthermore, at the beginning of this debate, you said that all it takes for a human being is nourishment and a little space. I just wanted to say that women should have the right to abort a child if they're aware that they do not have the nourishment or space in which to care for the child. In that certain aspect, would you rather have the woman abandon the child?
No. In fact, I would rather the woman talk to any myriad of groups that would love to help her put the baby up for adoption, place the baby for adoption, provide the woman with anything that she needs. When I'm there at the abortion clinic, we're not just sitting there telling them, it's wrong morally or whatever. We're there to try to help them, to try to talk to them about what their situation is at. And so we certainly would rather every child, and here's the thing, every child is wanted by someone. Would you agree that every child is wanted by someone?
No.
Okay. Well, the problem is that if there's about a million couples that are looking to adopt in America, and that's from the National Adoption Society or Federation or whatever. And there's about 1 million babies that are aborted every year. So one of the things that I'm going to devote my life to is finding everybody, finding the adopting ones and finding the ones that are wanting to abort so that we can stop this atrocity that's happening.
I would say that's very, very admirable.
Thanks, John.
My question is for you, sir, John. I don't remember your last name, I'm sorry. And if I can say it succinctly, maybe 2 questions. You agree that the golden rule is universal and goes back thousands of years. Love your neighbor as yourself. Yet, you said that we can't condemn slavery in the Founding Fathers because it was acceptable. Yet, I would argue that none of them would have been willing to have been made slaves. Just guessing. So morally, you've said that love should be the principle, love your neighbor as yourself, and yet they weren't willing to apply that. So it seems like we should be able to condemn it as immoral. So I'd like for you to comment on that. And then just one other thing. You mentioned the 3 things that make for personhood. Intelligence, moral creatures, and that they appreciate art. 1-month-old babies have none of these. And so my question would be, since they are not fully developed and they don't have those things, should they be able to be killed? Or at what point do we know that they have these things?
No, I wouldn't say they should be killed. I'm saying they don't have the value that you have as a moral agent, as an intelligent person, as someone presumably who enjoys and appreciates and maybe creates art yourself. I'm not saying it should be killed. I'm saying the value of a fetus or the value of an infant is not the value of you and me, having lived and developed and so on. The golden rule we find, and I can send you that citation, in China, in India, in all those, they all have it. But morality is what we should do, not what is done. So as a matter of fact, throughout history, there have been slaves. From the way back. One African tribe captures another, they're slaves.
So is that morally wrong?
Well,
If love is what we should do, is that morally wrong?
The standard, if you have a universal standard, but it's one thing to agree that this is the ideal. It's something else to put that ideal into a historical context. And one can say, well, yes, from the point of view of this, from the universal perspective of God, it's wrong. But from the point of view of a society, it's what the fact that highly moral people, including St. Paul, presumably, believe that slavery was justified, suggests that we should not just say, all these people are wrong, all these people are immoral. Consciousness changes over time. It used to be immoral.
We can't put on Paul that he justified slavery. He commented about it, but that didn't mean he justified it.
Yes.
So so we can't say that that's what he justified, just to be clear.
But he talked about how we should treat it.
Absolutely.
But the simple point is that what to highly intelligent, educated, and moral people seemed allowable in 1650 or 1750 or even 1850, before the Civil War. We're talking about Jefferson. We're talking about Washington. Can you find people who are more... there were always those who opposed that.
But you agree that they had the principle of love your neighbor as yourself, correct?
Well, I don't know what they had, but the point is that consciousness moves. What used to be allowed is no longer allowed. Those who want to hold on to the old ways, hold on to preserve, conserve, we call conservative. Those who see something wrong with these old ways because they deny freedom are called progressive or liberal. We see the movement of consciousness in the world toward greater and greater and greater freedom. Certainly in the West, I can make that case. Maybe not in Africa, maybe not in the Middle East, maybe not in Indonesia or Malaysia. But certainly in the West, I can make the case that consciousness, and if there's a God, then that consciousness is God's consciousness, is moving. Martin Luther King could say, I'm speaking for God in saying, no longer should I wait. No longer.
And I'm going to ask...
Either on the side of the old or side of the new, or you can be part of the movement from the old into the new.
In order to try and get to as many people, let's not have a give and take unless the speaker is at the front invite you to a follow-up question. I'll go here first.
Regarding us contacting this area and everything, we researched if you two were male in general. Number one, this is about abortion and not everything else, but everybody who owns a penis in this room will never experience pregnancy, will never experience an abortion, give the non-uterus part. We are ultimately the ones that need to decide if it is morally wrong or whatnot. You two definitely have a right to have an opinion, and this could have been a dinner party for all who cares, but if we're not silencing anybody, we're just speaking up for ourselves and our gender.
Scott, John brought up the issue of fertilized eggs in a petri dish, and should a man be charged with murder if he allows the fertilized egg to thaw? So in a similar vein, first of all, what is your opinion on that? But in a similar vein, also, pro-life activists often say things like at a certain number of days, say a fetus has or a zygote or whatever it's called at that point, has a heartbeat, its own brain waves, et cetera, et cetera. Could you also, in a similar vein, address the issue of, say, for example, a Plan B pill for the fertilized egg prior to that time when that fertilized egg has any identifiable human traits of its own?
Yes, you're right. So the question is, should someone that destroys a fertilized egg in a petri dish be charged with murder? I think the problem with that, I'm not sure I would go there. The problem is that our society has not done a very good job of defining these terms yet. I think we can get there, but I don't think that you could say with malice aforethought, which is how the law describes it, with previous malice, someone would do that. Now, if they did it on purpose, if you could establish that. And it's a similar question, and I'll get to your other one real quick, but it's a similar thing because when people say, well, should women be punished for having abortions? I think historically that's never happened. Doctors have been persecuted and prosecuted for doing abortions when they were illegal, but women have never been the target of investigation for that. So what I would say would be, you have to establish malice aforethought. Now, I'm at the clinic a lot. Some women know exactly what they're doing. And some women don't really know what they're doing. Because frankly, the abortion industry lies to women all the time about what they're doing and what it is. And as far as the Plan B pill, yes. I mean, if you're taking the abortion pills given at the clinics and around, and what the abortion pill does is it basically, if there's anything in there, if there's a fertilized egg in there, it basically causes the woman, I won't get into the details, but causes the woman to miscarry very painfully and very tragically. I would argue that once all these things are established, that yes, the abortion pill will be illegal.
Yes, anywhere from 60 to 80 million babies have been killed. One-fifth of the population. One-fifth of the population. Will they look back 100 years from now and say how evil and unloving and cold we were? We say slavery was bad. But 1/5 of the population, 60, 80 million babies, more than all of the wars. Thank you.
Hi, this one's directed for Scott. Do you consider sperm a human being?
Nope.
But doesn't it have the potential to be a human being?
Not by itself.
No?
No.
So the potential is only once the sperm and the egg have met?
Yep.
Okay, that was all.
You met some pro-lifers who said it was probably.
No, I just think.
Oh, okay.
No.
Thank you.
I've just got a question, 3 actually, well they're short, but directed towards Mr. John. And I was just wondering, first, it's a simple yes or no question. At the time of conception, from then on, is the being considered a fetus?
No.
So it
There are all
goes through
kinds
some
of, there's
stages?
the zygote, there's the embryo, there's the, no, it's not a fetus from that point, no.
Okay, so when around that time does a fetus become a fetus? Like what time?
Well, that's a medical thing. We have a doctor here. I don't know, the zygote, the embryo, and at some point, I mean, it's terminology, but there are divisions as to how many weeks or how many months it is before it's termed. It's termed. These are different terms for stages.
Okay, so we do commit abortions on fetuses, correct?
Well, the problem is that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it could be that a fertilized egg is considered a human being, and then the people who work in birth control clinics, the fertilization clinics, if those eggs are allowed to thaw, they'll accuse them of murder. Or if a woman is in an accident and miscarriages, they may accuse her of murder if the accident were her fault. Or suppose she not paying attention and she falls down the steps and miscarriages her fetus. Will she be accused of murder? The problem is, if you start the law here, it's a very easy thing to keep sliding and sliding and sliding and sliding. Are we going to send women out to farms to make sure they're treated and get the proper nourishment? And if they don't give the proper nourishment to the child in their home, would they be considered murder if the child dies? Where is this going to stop?
So, you being a Latin teacher, you would agree with me that fetus is the Latin word for young one or young child, right?
Well, but that's not how it's used medically.
But we still call it that, and there's still a reason that we call it that.
Well, the fact that that's how it was used 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago does not mean how that the medical community wouldn't call a fetus, I wouldn't think, a child.
Hi.
Or a baby. They wouldn't call them that. Now, sloppily, or I don't mean sloppily, but carelessly, we could say, well, you have a baby inside you. Well, you know, it's. So I don't mean to say it's just a matter of semantics, but it seems to me that there's a difference between a baby and a fetus. We have two words, two different stages of human development.
Next question.
Hi. Scott, do you have any pets?
Yes.
Are they spayed and neutered?
Yes.
Why?
Because God told me to. I have no idea where this is going. This is so good. The cat was spayed before we got her. The dog was too. So you'll have to ask Petco and the people in St. Cloud where we got the Great Dane.
Okay.
So
Well, just to...
by the way, they're both very happy with being that way. They think that they're living their best life because of it. So
Good. The reason people spay and neuter their pets is because it's considered ethical to do so.
Right.
And within the scientific community, morals doesn't really factor into things too much, so people look to
I've heard
ethics.
about that, yeah.
So ethics would be the thing that people look to when they don't look to morals. That's about it.
Okay. Fair enough.
Actually, for John and anyone who believes in abortion, actually, you're here because your mother gave birth to you. Are you really saying that you wish she would have aborted you? Your life is that miserable? Because to believe in abortion, you don't know what that child might have been. He might be the next world great leader. He might discover the cure for cancer. That child could be someone that could really benefit each one of our lives. My wife and I adopted 4 children.
Congratulations.
And I know many other people that have.
Congratulations.
And there are people that would adopt these children rather than being disposed of.
Yes, I understand that, and if that were the case, it'd be great. Every child that was born, not wanted by the parents, were adopted, that'd be wonderful. We wouldn't even be here. I'm here because I was asked to be here, and I'm here because I was asked to defend the woman's right to choose. That's why I'm here tonight. But suppose it's a Hitler. There's a Christian minister named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrestled with this question. If I had the opportunity to kill Hitler, should I? And his answer was absolutely. Absolutely. It would have been better that he not be born. And there's a passage in the Bible that says something like that, and I don't know precisely the context.
Yeah.
But there are...
Referring to Judas.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
So then we board everybody?
Next question.
My name's Jesse. Don't let the hair fool you. I'm not a woman. I do identify as a musician, though, which will be part of my comment. But I first wanted to address something to our guests respectfully. And I mean it respectfully. They blessed me twice when I've sneezed tonight, and they've been very gracious. But as a man, I have 2 abortions in my past. And I do know what it's like to go through an abortion. I was a different person then. I leaned politically liberal, and I wasn't walking with God, and I wanted to support her choice. And it has grieved me to this very day. And I had a lot of great reasons why that was convenient for me. But I do have to live with that. The other thing I wanted to mention as a musician, and it's not just music, but, and maybe some of the mothers here could comment on this, but I've heard story after story after story from pregnant mothers about their baby responding to the sound of their voice, or the father's voice, or to the father singing to them, or singing, playing music. And even in the Bible, when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, yeah, she, when she hears her cry out, Elizabeth's baby leaps in her womb. So, and I figured since you brought up Genesis, that might be worth mentioning. You don't have to comment on it, I just wanted to share that.
Are we time-wise? How are we? Maybe do one more?
3 minutes.
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
In response to your comment, can you imagine how much worse it would be if not only the baby was dead, but the mother was too? We keep neglecting to talk about women's rights in this forum, and unfortunately,
Especially little ones.
I don't really care about those right now because I'm alive and I'm a woman and I have rights. So as a woman who is alive and has rights and is speaking right now, I'm just wondering how you react to the women that are hurt, are dead, or pretty much permanently damaged if we make legal abortions illegal. What's going to happen to them?
Yeah. We should help them. We should not condemn them.
How are we going to help them if they are dead?
Right. Well, we should create a culture that doesn't say that children are disposable. We should create a culture that doesn't say that large groups of people are not able to... It kind of was interesting how quickly you just dismissed Jesse's point. And I think for people that for people that want to show compassion towards certain groups, you're essentially, again, proving that only certain groups get to be defended. No, that's exactly what it is. You're saying that Jesse's experience, it doesn't make any difference, that other experiences don't make any difference. So your question, and I'm glad you asked it. Every woman that is hurt by an abortion, the abortion doctor that does it illegally should be thrown in jail forever. Every woman that is injured by abortion should be protected and helped and brought back to care. Things happen. If people were, it's an awful thing for a woman to have to be, for a woman to die because of an abortion. And that's happened sometimes. And actually abortion, speaking of Roe versus Wade, if I may, abortion is actually one of the least regulated medical industries in the United States. There are ambulances all the time at abortion clinics, at late-term abortion clinics throughout Florida. Why? Because women are injured all the time. And doctors are still performing them. I would invite you to go see the movie Gosnell if you haven't seen it yet. But yes, I'm not trying to be coy or anything. I'm just saying, yes, we should want to help every woman that is in that situation. The church should do a better job of helping women who are pregnant and not shaming them and not doing all that. I've been in evangelical churches for 25 years. I don't really see a lot of shame there. So I see a lot of people in my church, people who've been pregnant out of wedlock and people who get the help they need. Our church is great at adopting. We are trying to help on this issue. But saying that because of the complications of 0.01% of these issues, then we should make it, continue it to be legal, I think is a stretch legally. I'd love to talk more with you guys afterwards if you have.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, my name's Karen. I want to ask a question to that young lady real quick about, is the life of an unborn female important? And the point I want to make tonight is that, and you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the land. Medical technology today has evolved to the point where they can do surgical procedures on an unborn child. They can remove tumors. Right. They can clear up cardiac abnormalities. They can operate on urinary tracts. Let me ask the audience a question. Why would somebody go to the trouble to take care of an unborn child to such extent when others just want to discard something that they call a clump of cells or a fetus? And I think I know the answer. It's about love. Mothers love their babies that are in the womb. That's the normal way to do things. You love that child, that defenseless child. And surgeons who take the time, and the hospitals that take the time, and the parents who spend the money to have their unborn child repaired that way so that when they're born, they're healthier, that's love.
I guess we'll end on that and I'll let you two catch up. Thank you so much again, all of you, for coming tonight. I know there were so many questions we weren't able to get to, but we do have to be respectful of the time that we have. Oh yes, and Scott at least says he's happy to talk to as many people as want to talk afterwards. I don't know if John wants to extend the same invitation on the other side or not. I'll let him decide that. But anyway, thank you all for coming tonight.